Welcome to Talent Bus, where I talk with SaaS companies on how they are doing their talent acquisition. And in these episodes, I'm talking with Barbra Gago, founder of Pando. And they are building career frameworks, and that's the topic we are discussing today. And let's start the episodes from why career frameworks are important and what are the benefits for your SaaS business around those.
I think there's a couple of key things. So, first of all, any employee engagement survey that any company does always comes back with lack of career progression as a main insight that they're hearing from employees. So it's a thing that's directly correlated with employee engagement. It's directly correlated with employee retention. A lot of times we tell people when we're recruiting them that they can come here, they can grow, they can have a career path. And then when they arrive, it's like, they get thrown in and maybe it's like a fire hose for about a year. And then they're like, okay, well, now what? Like, where is my path? What is my path? And oftentimes companies don't have a really good, clear way of articulating what that looks like for folks. So I think at a high level, it's definitely retention and engagement that are the biggest kind of factors related to employees. But I think a more nuanced benefit is really, I've spent a lot of time thinking about employee development and thinking about employee engagement and how we look at people as a system within our organization. How do we optimize that resource the best we can? You mentioned you have a sales and marketing background, and I also have a sales and marketing background. So coming from looking at funnels and pipeline and figuring out all the little points at which I can optimize that funnel to get the best outcome is something that we don't really do on the people side. We look at that on an annual basis when we do performance reviews, but we don't really think about how do we actually optimize this journey to get the best impact. And I think that's through career development and growth, with the assumption that the more employees grow, the more impact that the company will have in terms of better revenue or better business outcomes.
Exactly. And I think from kind of retention point of view, if I think about kind of my own experience in the past and kind of what has been typically the phase when I've been thinking like, hey, should I do something else, go for another company? And I think most of the time, kind of one of the big reasons has been that I don't have kind of clear insight what I could be doing next within the company I'm working currently. Like what will be my next career path? So I can really kind of imagine that is a big challenge for a lot of people and kind of really affects on retention.
I personally left companies to level up, usually. That's how I increased my level and grew in my career and got exposed to different things. And I think it's very common for employees to feel that way. Also, with the way that we do, the way that employees grow today is really through performance management, which happens once a year. So if you're not in that cycle, and you're a top performer, it's not uncommon that you hear, okay, you're doing everything great. Yes, I want to promote you, but we have to wait till this point in time. And this is also another problem just in terms of how we think about employee progression and career development overall, because we're also kind of arbitrarily holding some people back who could go on to have a bigger impact, or then are retention risk because they leave to go get a better job somewhere else, or what they think is a better job at least.
Exactly. And I think for kind of leveling up, one kind of big challenge that is at least on my feeling on the market is one of the main ways of leveling up is kind of going up in the ranks in a way that, for example, a salesperson becomes a head of sales.
Mm-hmm.
And for most companies, I feel like that's kind of the only way to level up as a salesperson.
Yeah.
And it's quite weird because, for example, I personally believe that I'm good at sales. I have had a great track record on that one. But then when I was kind of promoted for head of sales, I still don't believe that I'm the best possible head of sales. I'm not the best possible leader for people. And
Right.
but suddenly that was basically the only way to go. And actually, I thought that I want to go that way because that was basically the only way to level up. So I wanted to go there. But now, kind of looking after that for that decision, like I believe that there might have been some other option, and I might have thrived even better if I would only focus on sales and not sales leadership. So I think that's a typical challenge, like going up.
Yeah, there's actually it's called the Peter Principle, and it basically is this phenomenon that happens within organizations that we promote people to their level of incompetence, basically, which sounds intense, but actually is what happens, which means you have a high-performing salesperson or you have a high-performing engineer, and you promote them until they get to a point where they have no clue what they're doing. And oftentimes that's into a manager role. And I think this is a big shift that we're seeing in the market and how companies are thinking about career pathing generally, in terms of enabling folks to take that individual contributor path where they can be a master of a specific domain or a subject matter expert versus a manager. And it's the old way that you have to get promoted into a manager because that's the only way to grow and sort of continue to build your income and your success at the organization. And now that is definitely changing because of that issue and that phenomenon where you promote your best salesperson to a manager and then the whole team ends up suffering. You do worse because the impact of that person not being able to manage well and not having the skills to do that negatively, obviously, in fact, they aren't getting the results they used to get, and it doesn't directly multiply to the folks that they're managing. So that's something that companies are becoming more and more aware of. It's definitely something that's changed. Also, the data shows that I think only 12% of employees even want to be managers. So it's also, there's been this people getting promoted because they think that's the only way they can grow in their career and level up, and then also being kind of unhappy and disengaged in that role because they're not good at it or they don't even like it. And so, yes, this concept of sort of parallel pathing, I've seen it more in the US, I would say, than in Europe. I think Europe is a little bit behind the trend there, but they are coming around to really thinking about it in a parity. And I would push companies even to consider having the pay bands for a manager level and an IC level that are the same be similar rather than saying manager is better, therefore we pay them more. So this is really a big shift that I am excited for and I think will happen at some point. But that's definitely, the way that we pay people obviously reinforces those values and those beliefs that folks have. So if we're paying managers more, then people will still assume that that's the role they need to take in order to continue to grow.
Yeah. But hey, what got us today here kind of regarding this podcast was actually SaaS stock. And I participated at the workshop over there that you had regarding kind of career frameworks, and I think that was kind of super interesting framework. So can you just quickly give a kind of intro to the kind of career frameworks? What do you mean by that? And kind of we've talked a little bit on kind of where the idea for this came from, but I think kind of your story was super interesting. So can you share that one with the audience as well?
Yeah. So I think when I talk about career frameworks, and I would say that everybody has a slightly different idea of what they are or what they mean. When I refer to a career framework, I'm referring to basically the relationship between the levels and the leveling framework that you built for your organization. So how many levels do you have at the company? And oftentimes companies will associate those with compensation bands. So like, okay, you have level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 engineer, and then maybe you have a manager track that starts at, well, it depends if it's a stacked leveling framework or if it's parallel, but you would have a manager track as well. And so one piece is the levels, and the other piece is thinking about the role of the individuals, and in that context, what are the skills and competencies that people need to be developing in order to progress either in the track that they're on. So let's say it's an engineer, maybe it's a front-end engineer and they want to stay in the front end. So what are the competencies that a front-end engineer needs to be developing? And then those competencies would be defined at each level. So it's the levels are consistent across the organization. It doesn't matter if you're an engineer or a marketer. If you're a level 4, these are the standard for this company. But if you're an engineer level 4, these are the competencies that are relevant to you. And so the career framework is the combination of those things combined. I've spent a lot of time building and scaling teams throughout my career, both in the people space as well as collaboration. So I helped bring Culture Amp as well as Greenhouse to market, which are on the people side. And most recently, I was the CMO at Miro, and I had joined when there was already a little bit of a team there who had been there for quite some time. And so this was my tool as a leader to come in and help people on the team understand everybody had a title, and that's oftentimes how people associate their level based on title. But I think you should think about levels and then titles and actually focus more on level progression rather than title. Hiring based on title, for example, gets you in trouble because it's always not really anchored to level expectations. But I was able to build a leveling framework and the rubric, which kind of created these career frameworks for employees to understand, okay, I'm a level 4 marketer. There's a level 5, there's a level 6, and this is what that looks like. And these are the skills that I should be working on and developing. And that really helps anchor people in where they're at within the organization, the context of where they're at, and also see, okay, there is actually a path here. There are expectations at each level. There are things I'm doing now and things I could be doing in order to level up to the next step. And that's really kind of what I refer to when I think about career frameworks. Career pathing then gets into like, what are the different steps? Is it linear? Are you going, front-end engineer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or do you want to become a back-end engineer? Or if you're a marketer, do you want to become product marketing, or maybe you want to get into sales? And that's where you can still use those rubrics and frameworks to help navigate, okay, you have these skills and those skills align with these other roles, and then you could potentially, go into those different jobs as well.
And you mentioned earlier there regarding the research that roughly like 12% of people want to become a manager at some point. And I feel like that is one of the kind of biggest pitfalls that companies are having, that's the only way really to level up in a company. But now when kind of working with a lot of companies regarding career frameworks and career planning, are there some kind of other kind of very typical mistakes that companies are doing around this topic?
Well, I think they might not be obvious mistakes. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the levels often and the career frameworks are often, engineer 1, 2, 3, 4, senior, lead, tech, manager, director, engineer. It's like, okay, there's one path. And if you're a senior engineer, it's like, that's it. You have to keep going to management in order to progress. And that's where most people will end up getting stuck at, maybe like level 4, level 5. So I would say splitting the paths, making them more parallel, which means maybe you have engineer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, senior, principal, architect, whatever they are, but those more senior levels actually are more aligned in parallel with the manager track. I would say a pitfall would be if you split those tracks and you say, we have an IC track and we have a manager track, but then if the manager track is paid significantly higher than that senior IC track, then you're basically just splitting it apart, but actually you're not, because you still pay these other roles so much more. And I think this is a more hidden thing because you don't necessarily know what the pay bands are. In the US, pay transparency is becoming much more present because there's a lot of legislation going in state by state where you have to show your compensation bands for different roles. So this is going to force companies to think about this more holistically, which I think is a good thing. So I think stacking your levels, meaning having the IC path feed directly into manager path and having that clear in the compensation is one major pitfall. I think a lot of times companies will develop levels and career tracks in different ways with different number of levels for different teams. Like this engineering team has 6 levels, customer success has 4 levels, marketing maybe only has 3 levels. I think sometimes that's because you only have a few people on the team and you're like, oh, well, we only use these 3 levels. So there's just those 3 levels in the path. But the problem is if you don't calibrate the levels across the organization, if you don't have level 3 mean the same thing, it's really hard for employees to understand sort of where they actually fit in the context of the broader organization. The bigger you get as you scale, it's much harder to track and understand how different cohorts of your org are growing. Like, are all your junior people growing in the same way or mid-level people? Because you have this miscalibration of level 3 in engineering is way more senior than level 3 in marketing. Like, that shouldn't be the case. And so we really should have those levels be consistent. And if you have only a couple of people in a function, that's okay. You can still have more levels and you just don't necessarily use every level, but at least you're calibrating those levels consistently. And I think also not making it transparent is a pitfall that many companies have built leveling frameworks. They map their compensation to it. They use it behind the scenes, but they don't make it transparent to employees. I think this is something that's changing 100% because there's so much more kind of bottoms up demand from employees and managers to know what the steps are and have transparency around it. But those are a couple that I can say off the top of my head.
Yeah. And then maybe for kind of people thinking, okay, now I have different levels. Let's take marketing as an example. And I have level 1, level 2, level 3. Like, what could be the things kind of inside of that level that would be, for example, the competencies or other kind of traits of the people? Can you share just some examples so people kind of really get the idea on what kind of things you should be kind of measuring there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of documented examples, I would say, of frameworks. Generally, I would say they're a bit high level and a little obscure. So companies go through the process of doing this work, but then they're a bit ambiguous. So they're a little hard for employees to use. That's why we built Pando to help be a lot more structured and clear around this. But I think what is really important to show in those levels at each level is really what's the general sort of scope of the role. Generally, what's the type of experience? It doesn't have to be a rule, like you can't be a level 4 unless you have 5 years experience. Like, it shouldn't be rigid, but you can have sort of guiding posts around what it looks like. The type of collaboration, the impact across the org, the circle of influence. Like, is it at a junior level, I'm collaborating with my team. At a more mid-level, I'm collaborating cross-functionally. At a more senior level, I'm working with leadership and junior people. So it's really like thinking about how the scope sort of grows in the organization. And then in terms of competencies themselves, we see that there are usually a combination of hard skills and soft skills in the career frameworks or the rubrics. Also, that there's a combination of values-based competencies. So a lot of companies really want to integrate their values into how they coach and develop and manage performance of employees. And so they will incorporate things like whatever a value might be, like think big, maybe that's a value. And then this then becomes incorporated into the rubric so that you're not able to really progress unless you're truly showing up as you need to within the values. So I think it's a combination of those things. For marketing, some of the standard stuff that might be in everybody's rubric could be communication, collaboration, but then more specific competencies might be, campaign strategy or lead nurturing or analytics or anything like that, where it's really like these are the core things that this role. And that, of course, could look different if you're growth marketing, if you're a brand marketer, if you're product, etc.
Yeah, of course. But one thing that like I've been personally thinking all the time is like having background from sales and marketing, and then coming to kind of recruitment, people, employer branding, and all that there is kind of a lot of kind of frameworks that you can steal from sales and marketing to kind of people field. And I think one of the things you mentioned earlier, employee lifetime value is one of them. And kind of as a sales and marketing professional, like I'm always thinking about customer acquisition cost and customer lifetime value. And I think like first, if we think about kind of career frameworks and kind of having a company where there is a lot of opportunities to grow, kind of if you successfully talk about those things in your employer branding during your recruitment process, you can actually get kind of your customer acquisition cost. So in this case, kind of how much does it cost to get new people in to your company lower. But then kind of as you mentioned earlier, like if you really have those kind of potential career paths inside of your company, retention gets lower. So basically employee lifetime value gets higher. But I think would be interesting to go a bit deeper on that one. So like in your experience, like do companies kind of understand the term like employee lifetime value? Are companies interested in that at all? Are companies measuring that one? And how do you believe that the career frameworks can really make that number higher?
Yeah, I think companies definitely understand the concept and think about the concept. And when I talk about employee lifetime value, I'm really talking about the outcome of an employee's performance. So what's the overall value created by each employee over time? When I was at Greenhouse, we used to kind of do these ROI calculations for better hiring. And one of the metrics that we used was employee, like revenue per employee. So the better companies are going to have more revenue per employee. And so this was like one way of measuring outcome for hiring the best talent. And I think when we look at employee lifetime value, I would say we haven't gotten to a place where there's like a really easy way for companies to track that yet. This is something we're working on as well. But there's a couple of kind of core things. So if you think about employee lifetime value as the total value created, and if you're looking at a chart, it's kind of like the volume of, the time that they've been at your company. There's a few kind of key levers. So when you hire somebody, there's a negative value because you've already spent time recruiting them. Then there's a point at which they ramp up and are contributing. And then there's like there's when they're fully contributing, when they decide to leave, and when they leave, basically. And so the way that we can really improve the way the outcome of employees impact while they're here is to obviously get great at recruiting and reduce as much as possible the upfront costs, hire the right people, ramp people up quicker, and get them contributing as quickly as possible. And then it's really about how high can they go and how high can they go over time. And that's how you really extend the volume. And how high they go and how high they go over time then makes them stay at the company longer, so you retain them longer. And so this really creates a lot more value and impact. So helping them level up, having clear paths around leveling up, having consistency around leveling up, having good managers who know how to coach and develop and kind of get people leveling up. enabling everybody to level up at the organization in a clear way also will create a more diverse pipeline of senior individuals as well as managers, which creates a better culture. And then, everybody's retained much longer. So I think those are kind of like the key points. I would say companies are definitely focused on looking at that and also figuring out how to track it more consistently. I don't think the way that we measure employee performance today works. We do it as point in time, sort of waterfall style through performance management, which is very subjective, has little context. The data is collected in a very inauthentic way because everybody's like, oh, performance reviews, let's, rub elbows and scratch each other's backs and give each other good reviews or whatever. So like all the data that we get about employee performance usually is just kind of like, so, and probably mostly not that good. So I think we really need to improve how we're looking at the way that we track employee performance, but those kind of key levers around hiring, ramping people up, and then having clear, consistent ways for them to level up and continue to drive impact at the organization over time is really the key things.
Yeah. Well, one thing that we have tried in TalentBee is basically stealing a framework called Pirate Metrics from kind of SaaS growth to kind of talent growth. And that has been, at least so far, working quite well. It kind of makes sure that you are focusing on the whole funnel, not only on the acquisition or not only on the retention, but making sure that you are kind of tracking the whole funnel. And then, for example, for the revenue part, what we are tracking, we are, of course, service business ourselves, so not a SaaS business, but we are tracking on that one the average monthly recurring revenue per employee and kind of seeing where that number is going. And of course, I think with all the ways that you can measure, there are always some challenges. You feel like you are missing some data, but then kind of you try to find the balance between kind of not measuring too much things, because then it just takes too much time, but really try to identify the most important ones for your company.
Definitely. I think we should just be looking at employee impact as much and caring about it in the same way in terms of measurement as we do with revenue. And we talk about dollar-based net retention, for example. So like, are we getting more revenue from our existing customers year over year? And this is like the similar thing with employees. Like, how do we get compounding returns essentially from employees? And we should really be figuring out how to optimize for that.
Exactly. But hey, lastly, we could talk a bit about kind of getting started. Like if someone now get excited that, hey, I should be doing this, and how to start. And for that one, we could actually use us as an example. I will be sharing with all the listeners in the show notes our own salary table. And I think kind of that is, of course, our kind of first version. We haven't been in the business for a super long time. It's no perfect, but I think it might be kind of an average way of kind of sharing that, hey, here's our salary levels, here's what is kind of expected on each level. So you can check out that one if you are interested. But kind of if we look at kind of that basic that a lot of companies have, they have some levels, not specific levels, maybe for different part of the organizations. And then there is kind of salaries in each level. And then there are maybe some kind of traits of the people on those levels. And I think that is a starting point for a lot of companies. So where would you kind of start if you were me? Like, what would you work on next?
Yeah, so I think a lot of companies start with compensation to build the level. So I would do the inverse and actually think about the leveling approach. So how big is the company? How quickly is it growing? Is it going to look similar next year, or is it going to look totally different? And really think through your levels, because this is a strategic exercise. It's how employees will move through the organization. It's how you create mobility. It's how you create career growth. I would recommend leaning into more levels with a little bit more granularity. So if you typically have 3 or 4 or maybe 5 levels, maybe consider going up to 9 or something like that. This really helps. You have to think through what is the distinction between each of these levels, of course, but this helps you kind of decouple career progression from title progression. You don't have to have the same a new title at each level. You could have one title for multiple levels. So start with the leveling framework. Look at examples, obviously. We have a lot of examples. There's plenty you can find online. So I think that's step 1. I would say step 2 in terms of the rubric is have a rubric, get employees used to competencies and thinking about competencies, but maybe just stick to 4, 5, 6 competencies. You could also have them be consistent for everybody at first. For example, we worked with a company that was actually pretty big, but they haven't done competency-based performance or feedback before. And so they started with an IC rubric and a manager rubric. And those IC rubric was for everybody. So it didn't matter if you're an engineer or a marketer. Here's the 8 competencies that everybody at this company needs to be good at. So you could start there as a way to kind of ease into it. Because I do think an important thing is to make sure that it's very clear what the expectations of each competency are at each level and what the general level expectations are. So the simpler you make it to start, the easier it will be to make it actually really usable for managers and employees. And then I would suggest, if you haven't done this before, that you introduce your levels and your competencies with a initiative around giving and receiving feedback. Because from my perspective, this is how you get to what I call sort of continuous progression and enabling employees to really anchor themselves where they are and understand how the feedback and how maybe you can, have ratings on those competencies, but how that is moving them down the field. And so if you introduce the levels, why you have the levels, what the competencies are, what the whole kind of rubric is, this is how you're going to move through the organization. This is how we're going to give you feedback. This is how you're going to understand how to get to the next level. And then you introduce that with, and we want to have feedback anchored around this. It will help everybody understand how to use the rubric more effectively, but it'll also help kind of kickstart a really good feedback culture that's anchored in constructive feedback, that's a little bit less emotional and vague and ambiguous, because it's about, okay, I'm giving you feedback on communication. You're a level 4. This is what communication at level 4 should be. So I have that context when I give you feedback on communication, and you also have that context when you're getting it. So I would suggest baby step into it. And eventually, I think using levels and competencies and rubrics is a way for companies to get to a much more real-time kind of progression model for employees once you kind of get to a scale and have a system to track all that.
And that's a wrap for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully you got a lot of good ideas about SaaS talent acquisition. If you enjoyed the episode, feel free to share it on your social so others can hear it too. And if you have a topic in mind that you would like me to cover in this podcast, share it with me as well. I'm Samuli, CEO and co-founder in TalentBee, where we help fast-growing SaaS companies in their talent acquisition. Make sure to follow us, make sure to follow this podcast, and have an awesome week. Bye-bye.